What's up? Doc Mike. Public Health on Call. By Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Today's topic for April 23, 2021. The Arithmetic of Compassion. Thank you, Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health.
Welcome to Season 3 of Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I'm Josh Sharfstein, Vice Dean for Public Health Practice and Community Engagement and a former Secretary of Maryland's Health Department. Our goal is to bring scientific evidence and experience to the public health news of the day through informative interviews with scientists, community leaders, policy experts, public health officials, clinicians, and more. If you have ideas or questions for us to cover, please email us at publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Smith-Rogers, producer of Public Health on Call. Today, Colleen Berry, chair of the Department of Health Policy and Management at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, talks with Paul Slovic, a professor of psychology at the University of Oregon, and Scott Slovic, a professor of literature at the University of Idaho. They discuss the psychological obstacles to compassion and how cognitive biases can lead to inaction in the face of the world's largest humanitarian challenges, including genocide, famine, climate change, and most recently, the COVID-19 pandemic. They also discuss what we can do to overcome these obstacles. Let's listen.
Paul Slovic and Scott Slovic, thank you both so much for joining me today. You are leading scholars in your respective fields of psychology and literature, and among your many accomplishments, you've published a book together, Numbers and Nerves, and are joining forces on an effort you refer to as the Arithmetic of Compassion. Paul, let's start with you. Can you first describe what you mean by the Arithmetic of Compassion?
Yes. What psychologists have learned over a long period of time is that we are motivated to do things by our feelings as well as by our thoughts and reasons for acting. And so our feelings are kind of our compass that gets us through our day when we have to make a lot of different sorts of decisions. And in particular, when we're considering a decision about whether or not to help someone in need, we are motivated first, of course, by the fact that they need our help, but second, because we feel good about helping them. It's what the economists have called the warm glow of satisfaction that you get when you do something good for someone. And over time, we've learned that our feelings behave in kind of peculiar ways with regard to number or scale. That is. They don't respond according to the rules of arithmetic, where the rules of arithmetic would be that, okay, you have one person in need, you feel strongly about helping them. Now you've got two people in need, you should feel twice as strong about helping them. Well, it doesn't work that way in ways we can discuss later. You know, the arithmetic behavior of our feelings is sort of weird. We say that our feelings are innumerate; they can't count, and so when we rely on our feelings, we tend to rely. We don't take the importance that we give to an individual life and scale it up proportionally as the numbers of lives increase. That's just one element of the what we call the deadly arithmetic of compassion. And so we can perhaps dive into that if you'd like.
Yeah, so let's do that. Paul, how do these psychological factors, how have they been powerful obstacles to effectively managing the COVID-19 pandemic? So exponential spread of the virus is hard for many people to understand, as is its numerical toll in terms of both death and human suffering. In your research, you talk about this concept of psychic numbing and how it challenges people's ability to follow public health guidelines for prolonged periods of time. Can you define for us what psychic numbing is and what it means for combating the COVID-19 virus transmission? And are there other psychological factors in addition to numbing that may cause us to stop following recommended protective guidelines?
What is obvious to us is that we care a lot about individual human lives, and we'll do a lot to protect or rescue an individual in distress. But what we see around us, and what we confirm with experiments, psychological experiments, is that concern doesn't scale up. We feel very strongly about an individual in need. We call that the Singularity Effect. One person, it's a very valuable life. But then if you're told, well, there are two people in need, you won't. If you're relying on your feelings won't be twice as strong as they are for one. They're already strong for one. It'll be something less than that. And so the difference between no one at risk and one person is huge. If I told you that there were 27 people in danger, you'd feel badly and concerned. If then I said, oh, wait, I made a mistake, there are 28, you won't feel any different. Our feelings are not that different. They can't differentiate between 27 and 28. We have to rely on a different way of thinking, which is analytic, which does the math, which simple math, say 28 is one more life than 27, and that life is important. Therefore, we should work even harder. You have to do that kind of thinking. But the human brain is lazy. If we think we can do the job and reacting with our feelings, which are easy, we don't bother to do the math. And so then we become insensitive as the numbers of lives increase. So the life that is so important, if it's the very first life at risk, loses its importance via feelings when there are more people at risk, and we sort of become insensitive to larger losses. And that's what we call psychic numbing. And we can see that in evidence with regard to the COVID pandemic, where we are given the statistics every day of the case numbers and the death counts and so forth. And they sort of, after a while, they just bounce off us. They don't create any feelings in us. We are numb to these statistics. And as a result, they don't motivate us as much as they should. That's psychic numbing. Now, you ask about other factors. Psychic numbing is one of the ways that our feelings deceive us with regard to COVID. And you mentioned exponential growth. Well, exponential growth of infection occurs when every infected person infects more than one other person. And so it grows. Let's say they infect two people, and then those two people, each of them infect two others. So you see the growth, it goes from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16. That's an exponential growth pattern. And what psychological research going back to the 1970s found is that people don't grasp exponential growth very readily. They project in a straight line way when it's really steeply rising. And as a result, the cases which seem so small right at the beginning, but are growing exponentially, we don't anticipate how quickly they can leap up and overwhelm the system. And that has happened in many parts of the world where even public health officials as well as governments were slow to react because the numbers were still small but growing exponentially. So that's another way that our perceptions are misguided. One other factor which is really important here has to do with the ability to maintain adherence to the protective guidelines put out by experts. And this is a problem because we don't feel rewarded for doing the things that we're told to do, like wearing masks, staying at home, isolating, keeping our distance from people. We don't see the benefits, who we're being protected from, or who's protected from us. The benefits are invisible because they wouldn't show up. They're statistical and invisible, but the costs are immediate and felt directly. So we can feel the cost of having to stay home and not be able to go to restaurants or bars or to our workplace. We feel the costs and we don't see the benefits. And if we do the wrong things, we don't feel the cost of that either. We don't see the harm we're doing, but we see the benefit of not adhering to the guidelines. We get to do what we want to do. So what psychologists call the reinforcement schedule is backwards for what is needed to maintain behavior over a long period of time. And so that's why we see that even well-meaning people who want to do the right thing, who are listening to the experts, they can't persist in adhering to this. Over time they start to relax. So those are other psychological factors. The bottom line here is that control over the COVID pandemic is as much a behavioral issue as it is a medical and public health issue, that we have to have both the medical side and the behavioral side working in sync to devise ways to keep people doing what the experts believe is the right thing to do.
So those are incredibly powerful psychological factors that are occurring right now. And I want to get back to, in a moment, what we can do about them. But first, let's bring Scott into the conversation. We've been talking psychology up to this point, but Scott, you're a professor of environmental humanities. You study literature, teach writing, and think about environmental communication. Can you connect the arithmetic of compassion to your own discipline generally and in the context of COVID-19?
Yes, thanks, Colleen. Well, I would first point out that the very phrase arithmetic of compassion comes from literature. As we explain in the introduction to the book Numbers and Nerves, the Polish poet Zbigniew Herbert, in a poem from the 1970s titled Mr. Cogito Reads the Newspaper, he actually presents a character in the poem reading the newspaper and reading different kinds of stories, one about a mass casualty event, the other one about a small-scale tragedy. And actually, in this poem, Mr. Cogito Reads the Newspaper, Herbert explores the differential ways that his literary character responds to these different kinds of information. And then in the final phrase of the poem is a subject for meditation, the arithmetic of compassion. And so that's where we've stolen this phrase to describe this psychological phenomenon, actually emerging from literature. And when you mentioned that I study literature, of course I was trained to study poetry and short stories and literary essays and so forth. But what I've come to understand over time is that I'm really interested in and have certain skills to analyze human cultural expression more broadly, not just fine arts, but varieties of ways in which humans express ourselves and receive information. And in the environmental humanities, over time, we've developed a number of significant ways for analyzing our ability, our sensitivity to receive information, and our insensitivity. And what Paul has just been describing in psychological terms are various ways in which we are insensitive to important information. And ironically, the more important the information, the larger the scale of a problem or a challenge, the less sensitive we become.
So COVID-19 or genocide.
Exactly. Or extinction, or toxic environments and so forth. The larger the scale, the less we care, the less sensitive we are. So from an environmental humanities perspective, I'm interested in what some of my colleagues refer to as apprehension. How do we find a way to apprehend things that happen on such a vast scale that psychologically makes us insensitive, or happens very slowly? Sometimes these events occur over vast spans of time that exceed human sensory capacity, or they simply take place out of view. We can't see them happening, and thus we are insensitive to their significance. And so we refer to this as slow violence in the environmental humanities, things that occur on temporal and spatial scales that challenge our sensory abilities. Another aspect of the environmental humanities is what people refer to as precarity. and sometimes in my particular field, eco-precarity. How do we become sensitive to our vulnerability to certain phenomena? I find this particularly relevant to the COVID-19 situation, where we see people acting as if life continues as normal. Initially there was this hypersensitivity to this new phenomenon that we were unfamiliar with. It was invisible, but we learned that we should be extremely careful about our contacts with other people. And now I see people lapsing into a kind of relaxed condition, finding it very difficult to maintain vigilance. And so understanding various aspects of precarity are extremely important on the individual psychological level, and also culturally, as we try to think about the ways in which certain kinds of people are more precarious or more vulnerable than others. This has an ethical component and also a kind of a sensory and a cognitive component. And then finally, just to boil it all down, I would say that the singularity effect that Paul referred to has a profound relevance to communication that in literary studies we might refer to poignancy, something called poignancy. What makes a certain way of speaking or a certain way of writing or communicating otherwise poignant, more poignant or less poignant. And often we find that when we can reduce the scale of a phenomenon to an individual or some otherwise smaller scale, what some might call human scale, then we can enable our audiences to be more sensitive to phenomena that they really should care about.
So that's great. And I want to sort of go a little more into your discipline here, and in a personal way, Scott. So during the pandemic, life is not normal, and people are spending more time at home than usual. And many, including myself, are looking for interesting books to read, in particular work that can help us understand this experience that we're going through of the pandemic. Can you recommend any pandemic literature? And what do you find to be some of the lessons about experiencing a pandemic that we can, and you touched on this a little bit a moment ago, but that we can glean from such writings?
Yeah. Well, first of all, before the current pandemic occurred and we became aware of it, I had never heard the phrase pandemic literature. I know other people were studying this, and some were probably even developing syllabi for courses on pandemic literature. There's a vast history of this going back centuries, but it was not really on my radar until I found myself in the midst of a pandemic. And so I tend to be a scholar of contemporary literature and culture. And I've realized that many of the writers that I'm interested in have been engaged with the subject of disease and large-scale disease, epidemics or pandemics. And these include people like the nonfiction writer David Quammen, who in 2012 published a book called Spillover, which is a sobering and eloquent analysis of zoonotic disease. And I was interested in Quammen's work, so I was attentive to the arrival of this book. But I wondered, why was David Quammen writing about zoonosis, and in addition to island biogeography and endangered species and other kinds of things that he writes about in other work? I didn't realize how zoonosis, the spillover or leaping of disease from one species to another, was so profoundly relevant to our lives every day. It took a pandemic to wake me up to the importance of that book from 2012. And then more recently, people have invited me to give talks on pandemic literature. So I've studied up a little bit and been looking at recent examples of this, such as Geraldine Brooks' 2001 novel called Year of Wonders. That book, thumbs up to that. And other books from an American perspective include Peter Heller's 2012 novel, The Dog Stars. And very recently, obviously written prior to the current pandemic, but published with ideal timing in 2020 is Lawrence Wright's novel called The End of October. And all of these describe different pandemic scenarios, or I don't know whether technically Geraldine Brooks' book, which describes a small village in England, is a pandemic or an epidemic, but we can take away certain lessons from reading these works, in addition to using them as mirrors to our own experience to help us understand things about our own lives, so, recognize aspects of our own lives in this other work that we may not be able to see because they're too close to us in our lived experience. I find myself interested in such topics as normalcy and how it is that characters I'm thinking particularly of the protagonist in The Dog Stars, Peter Heller's 2012 novel, how some sort of influenza epidemic has occurred in North America and perhaps elsewhere in the world. It's a little bit hazy, the scale of this disease, but obviously the casualties have been tremendous, and the protagonist has lost even his wife and all of his community, and he's living a life of isolation, primarily having social contact with his dog. It takes place in Colorado, and this guy has a small airplane, and he flies around the Rocky Mountains looking down at the landscape, and everything seems normal below. It looks like it's the world as it's always been, but he's existing in this strange suspended state post-epidemic, and he's lost the people he cares about. He's isolated from almost all human contact, and yet occasionally he lapses into this psychological condition of normalcy, feeling comfortable, even appreciating the beauty of what he's looking at. And I find that lines up very closely to my own experience of the pandemic, where I can sometimes forget that we're in the midst of a very serious public health crisis. As I look out my window, as I walk down the street, it's only when I notice my neighbors all wearing masks, and when we're walking down the street and we dart to the other side of the street in order to maintain social distance, I realize this isn't normal. Something very strange is going on. And I find myself fascinated with the rising and falling of sensitivity to our current public health crisis. I find this explored in the literature too. And by reading the literature, I can be more conscious of what's actually happening in my own lived experience.
And that story resonates, I think, for all of us who've lived through the past year. And I'll say that Geraldine Brooks novel definitely brings to mind the point about poignancy that you were talking about before. Very much comes through in that book. Scott, you and Paul seem to share a last name. I'm curious to hear, maybe just briefly, about how you started collaborating, and more generally, what it means to bring disciplines together, in your case, psychology and literature, to wrestle with humanitarian challenges like COVID and some of the others that we've been speaking about today.
Well, Scott and I thought we were working in different fields. Scott, when he decided to be to major in English and then environmental literature, it seemed that he was on a different path. But as he indicated, people who were studying environment, many of them are concerned about the precarity of the environment on which all life depends. And so I was a decision-making and risk scholar, also looking at, instead of precarity, we call it a risk perception, and keeping people safe and healthy. And we realized that we had a similar interest in protecting life and the environment. And then we started to collaborate, and particularly we edited this book, Numbers and Nerves. We worked on it for 10 years, just at a slow pace because we so much enjoyed working on it together. We didn't rush, and then we realized, well, it's about time we stopped this and sent this to print, which we did. So that's kind of how we got started on this. And
Scott, what's it like working with your dad?
I would say sometimes the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And I grew up in an environment where we were discussing psychological ideas every day over dinner: sports, psychology, social crises and the need to engage with various situations around the world, humanitarian and environmental crises. So I have just woven my upbringing into my profession. And we over the years, I found that I'm particularly interested in psychological dimensions of environmental literature, writing about awareness, sensitivity, poignancy, forms of social engagement that might be supported or obstructed by certain types of cultural expression. And so over time, when we managed to spend time together, my father and I, usually running in the mornings, we would talk about our work, and we realized we're actually working on very similar topics. And as Paul says, we enjoyed these conversations very much. It was a great pleasure and very exciting to actually work actively on a publication project together and observe the way we each work individually on our articles and collaborate on this larger scale project. We've found, of course, that even though the book was published in 2015, we've been able to continue much of this work by way of creating a website, which we each continue to contribute to. And on the website, we offer many of the basic concepts that are in the book, as well as additional ideas that are not fully expressed in the book. And we've just realized that our collaboration doesn't have to end when the publication occurs, especially with these online formats that enable us to continue developing new ideas and applying them to current developments in the world.
And for our listeners that want to learn more, they can go to arithmeticofcompassion.org, I think. And I want to maybe turn the last question over to you, Paul, and to get back to COVID. What is the most important thing we should be doing right now that we're not doing when you think about the psychological literature that we were discussing earlier? And by we, I mean scientists, journalists, concerned citizens, and government officials. What are the most important lessons from your work?
Yes, I'm glad you used lessons in the plural, because I think there are multiple lessons and things we need to focus on. I think the first is to respect the science of virology and epidemiology, and to listen to what the scientists are telling us about the disease and how what we should be doing to protect ourselves as vaccines now come on the scene, and we tend to relax, and yet the problem is still with us. So we pay attention to the experts and respect what they're telling us. At the same time, I think, as Scott points out, there's an experiential element here. That is, the disease is difficult to deal with because it's for the most part invisible, unless we have experienced it personally, up close and personal. You can look around and everything looks normal, as Scott indicated, when it really isn't normal. And that's, again, where the role of experience comes in. So I think that journalists, in particular, could play a role in showing us the experience of what it's like to be ill or to take care of people who are ill, and they're doing that to a certain extent. In terms of giving us the stories of the healthcare workers on the front line, and how they're struggling to take care of people, and as well as people who have been ill, and telling us how they've experienced it. I think we need that kind of personal experience, as much as we do the statistics, maybe more than the statistics. But in addition, so we need that kind of experiential information. I think we have to respect the fact that we have to understand the behavioral principles that make it hard for people to keep following the guidelines, even though it's important. And so people need assistance there. If people are going to relax because they don't see the benefit and they don't see the cost of not doing things, then you need external action. You need some regulation. You need to have consequences for violating the guidelines, and also you need to reward people for following them, and particularly when following them has an economic, a social and economic cost to them. You need to try to buffer those costs, providing aid, and we see that that's being done to a certain extent. We have to keep doing that. because people need to need to survive economically here, and so you need external factors to come in and keep people towing the line as long as it takes to get this pandemic under control.
Paul Slovic, Scott Slovic, thank you both so much for joining me today on the podcast.
Thank you, Colleen. It's a pleasure.
Thank you, Colleen.
Public Health on Call is produced by Josh Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, and Stephanie Desmond. Audio production by Spencer Greer, Niall Owen McCusker, C.N. Oates, and Matthew Martin, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production support from Catherine Ricardo and Neiman Outland. Social media support from Brenda Haggader, Grace Holes Fernandez, and Caroline Wong. Thank you for listening.